In 1943, inside a heavily guarded United States military facility, a fire broke out that nobody could immediately explain. A fuel tank was destroyed. A general staff car burned to a frame. And the cause was not sabotage, not an accident with aviation fuel, not enemy action of any kind. The cause was bats, live bats, each one carrying a tiny incendiary bomb, released by accident inside an American military base that had been built specifically to weaponize them on purpose. Picture that for a moment, a facility funded by the United States government, staffed by trained military personnel, and the emergency alarm sounding not because of an enemy attack, but because a colony of frightened animals had done exactly what nature had always told them to do the moment they were set loose. This was a real, funded, deadly serious government program, approved by President Franklin Roosevelt himself, pursued for 2 years and nearly $2 million, and in the end, after all of that, the United States never once used it in actual combat. To understand how a nation ended up designing a weapon out of 1,000 live bats, and why it was quietly abandoned just months before it might have flown its first real mission, you have to go back to a single evening at the mouth of a cave in the New Mexico desert, on the very day the United States entered the Second World War. Carlsbad Cavern sits beneath the desert floor of southeastern New Mexico, a network of limestone chambers carved out over hundreds of thousands of years by water working slowly through rock. What has made the caverns famous for well over a century is not the rock formations themselves, but what lives inside them. Each year, hundreds of thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats migrate north from central Mexico to roost there through the summer months, and every evening at dusk they pour out of the cave mouth in a single, continuous, spiraling column, sometimes hundreds of thousands strong, rising into the darkening sky for the better part of an hour before scattering out across the desert to hunt insects through the night. One of the most striking wildlife displays in North America. One of the people who traveled to see that sight, in the first days of December 1941, was a dentist from Irwin, Pennsylvania named Lytle S. Adams. Adams was not a scientist and not a soldier. He held a dental degree and spent his spare time as an amateur inventor, tinkering with schemes for airmail delivery systems and aircraft designs that had mostly gone nowhere. He also happened to know Eleanor Roosevelt personally, a connection that would matter more than anyone could have guessed at the time. Adams stood at the mouth of Carlsbad Caverns that evening and watched the bats spiral upward. And the sheer scale of it, hundreds of thousands of individual animals moving as one dark, living cloud, lodged itself in his mind. A few days later, on December 7th, 1941, while he was still traveling through the Southwest, word broke that Japanese aircraft had struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States was suddenly, unavoidably, at war. Adams later described how the two events collided in his thinking almost immediately. If one bat could carry a small weight in flight and vanish into a building's rafters to roost by morning, what would happen if you attached a tiny incendiary device to that bat and did it to 1 million bats at once, releasing them over a Japanese city just before dawn? Japan's cities in the early 1940s were built overwhelmingly from wood and paper, packed tightly, with eaves and roof lines crowded close together across entire neighborhoods. Picture, Adams thought, thousands of small fires breaking out at once, in structures where firefighters would have no way of locating the source in time, because the ignition points were hidden inside the buildings themselves, tucked into the exact crevices where bats naturally take shelter. Adams had no scientific credential and no formal connection to the military establishment. And yet within weeks he had turned this idea into an actual letter addressed to the White House, a genuinely remarkable act of persistence for a private citizen with no institutional backing whatsoever. He wrote out his proposal in January 1942, and through his friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, managed to get it directly into the hands of the president. Roosevelt read it, and rather than dismiss it as the fantasy of an amateur inventor, forwarded it to the National Defense Research Committee with instructions to look into it seriously. Within months, the committee had assigned real scientists to the project, chemists, zoologists, and engineers, turning a dentist's idea about a cave full of bats into a funded government research effort with an official mandate to determine whether it could actually work. The first problem the scientists faced was choosing the right bat, and it mattered more than it might sound. The animal needed to exist in numbers large enough that the military could capture thousands of them without threatening a wild population, needed to be strong enough in flight to carry a payload heavier than its own body weight, and needed to be a species that would readily enter torpor, a hibernation-like state triggered by cold, since torpor was the only realistic way researchers could see to keep thousands of live bats calm, sedated, and packed together during transport. Mexican free-tailed bats fit nearly every requirement, existing in the hundreds of thousands across caves in Texas and New Mexico, capable flyers relative to their size, and reliably dropping into torpor when chilled. Researchers including Harvard zoologist Donald Griffin, who had done pioneering work on bat echolocation, and a young naturalist named Jack Kuffer, who later became a wildlife filmmaker, were brought in to design the system for capturing, sedating, and equipping the bats. Teams traveled to caves across New Mexico and Texas at night, timing their arrival to the evening flight, stringing nets across cave entrances and filling crates with bats plucked directly from the swirling mass overhead, standing in ankle-deep guano in total darkness while a living storm of wings brushed past their faces for the better part of an hour. Once captured, the bats had to be kept cool enough to stay in torpor during transport, packed into refrigerated containers and shipped by truck and rail toward whichever test site needed them that week. And more than once a shipment arrived with bats that had warmed too much along the way and were already awake and agitated by the time handlers opened the containers, forcing researchers to start the sedation process over from scratch. The incendiary device itself needed its own inventor, and the military found one in Louis Fieser, a Harvard chemist who that same year had developed a new gelled gasoline compound for the war effort, a compound that would become known worldwide as napalm. Fieser scaled his formula down to a size that could be strapped to a single bat, a small capsule fitted with a miniature time delay igniter, so that a bat released from an aircraft would glide downward still in torpor, wake as it fell into warmer air, and fly off to find the nearest dark crevice to roost, exactly as it would in nature, except this time carrying a live incendiary device timed to ignite after it had found shelter. To deliver the bats, engineers designed a specialized bomb casing, roughly the size and shape of a conventional aerial bomb, but hollow inside, fitted with stacked trays that could each hold hundreds of chilled, torpid bats, close to 1,000 animals in a single casing. The plan called for a bomber to release these casings at altitude, where a parachute would deploy partway down, the casing would split open, and the trays would release their cargo into open air, letting the bats rouse from torpor and scatter into the rooftops below. On paper, and in early laboratory testing, this looked almost elegant. In practice, it became one of the messiest programs the American military ever attempted to run. Testing began in 1942 at Muroc Army Airfield in California, later Edwards Air Force Base, before shifting to Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, chosen because it sat close to the caves that had inspired the whole idea. Early trials produced problem after problem. Some bats failed to wake from torpor in time and simply fell to the ground, incendiaries still attached, doing nothing at all. Others woke too early, still trapped inside the delivery casing, and refused to settle. Handling live, frightened bats by the thousands in a military test environment, with each one carrying a small bomb strapped to its chest, turned out to be exactly as difficult and unpredictable as it sounds on the surface. Then, in May 1943, the project produced its most infamous moment. During a test at Carlsbad, a batch of bats already fitted with live incendiary devices got loose before the scheduled test drop had even begun. Rather than being released in a controlled sequence over a target area, they simply escaped their containers and, doing exactly what free-tailed bats do by instinct, went looking for dark, tight places to roost. Some found their way under a fuel storage tank. Others made it into a nearby hangar. When the timers on their devices went off, fires broke out across the facility in a scattered, uncontrollable pattern. A hangar burned to the ground. A general staff car parked nearby was destroyed. The very same behavior that made bats such a promising delivery system for a weapon, their instinct to disappear into tight, hidden spaces, had just turned the weapon back on the people testing it. You would expect an incident like that to end a program on the spot. It did not. If anything, some observers treated it as proof of concept rather than failure, evidence that bats really would find hiding places and start fires exactly where you couldn't easily locate them, and that the only real problem left to solve was control, not the underlying idea itself. The project kept moving forward. By August 1943, responsibility shifted away from the Army Air Forces, whose leadership had grown increasingly skeptical that live bats could ever be managed reliably enough for genuine combat use, and over to the United States Navy, which handed it to the Marine Corps under a new, far more clinical name than bat bomb, Project X-ray. Testing shifted to the Marine Corps base at El Centro in California and eventually the WWII Proving Ground in the Utah desert, a site the military had already been using to test incendiary weapons against realistic mock targets. At WWII, engineers and set designers, some drawing on experience from the film industry, had built detailed replica villages meant to resemble Japanese wood frame construction, right down to the roofing style and interior layout, so that incendiary tests would produce results that actually meant something for a real bombing campaign. It was here, through the final months of 1943 and into early 1944, that Project X-ray produced its most striking and most unsettling results. Bats equipped with small incendiary devices were released over a mock village built specifically to simulate a Japanese urban target, and observers reported that the animals behaved almost exactly as predicted, scattering into the wooden structures and tucking themselves into eaves and attic spaces within minutes of release. Standard Oil Development Company, along with designers who had lived and worked in Japan before the war, had helped plan the replica structures with real attention to detail, matching the type of tatama matting used indoors and the particular joinery of the wooden framing, because engineers understood that testing against inaccurate buildings would produce meaningless data. When the incendiaries ignited on schedule, the resulting fires spread with a speed and unpredictability that traditional incendiary bombing, dropped in a straight pattern from a single aircraft, could not easily match. According to accounts from the test, the bats managed to start fires in more separate locations, using a comparable overall weight of incendiary material than a conventional bombing run would have achieved. For a weapon built around an idea most people would have laughed off in any other context, this was a genuinely alarming outcome, alarming in the sense that it suggested the bat bomb might actually work. And that raises a question worth sitting with honestly. This was never designed as a weapon aimed at a factory or a military base. It was designed to ignite uncontrolled fires across dense, largely civilian neighborhoods, with no way to steer the incendiaries toward anything other than wherever a frightened bat happened to land. The scientists and officers who pursued Project X-ray were operating inside the brutal logic of total war, a war in which mass incendiary campaigns against civilian infrastructure had already become standard practice for multiple combatants. The bat bomb did not invent that logic. It was simply one more attempt to carry it out with greater efficiency. By early 1944, the program had consumed close to $2 million, an enormous sum for the era, and had produced test results promising enough that Marine Corps leadership genuinely believed a combat-ready version could eventually be built. But when they carried their projections to Navy leadership, the numbers told a different story. Developing the bat bomb into a weapon reliable enough for actual battlefield deployment, they were told would take until the middle of 1945 at the earliest, and possibly longer, 2 more years of testing, refinement, and mass production, chasing a delivery system built around live animals that had already proven capable, entirely by accident, of burning down a section of an American air base. At the same time, a very different American weapons program was accelerating on a completely separate track, competing for exactly the same pool of scarce wartime scientific talent, industrial capacity, and government funding. The Manhattan Project had been steadily absorbing an ever larger share of the nation's scientific talent, industrial capacity, and secrecy resources since 1942, and by 1944 its leadership had grown increasingly confident that a working atomic weapon could be ready well before the middle of 1945. Faced with a choice between 2 unconventional weapons programs, each competing for funding, personnel, and institutional priority, military leadership made its decision. In March 1944, the Navy formally canceled Project X-ray. The bat bomb, after 2 years of research, 1 destroyed hangar, 1 burned staff car, and close to $2 million spent, never flew a single combat mission, and never got the chance to prove, one way or the other, whether it would have worked at scale against a real Japanese city. Here is where the story could simply end, filed away as a strange historical footnote about a weapon that never was. But the story does not end there, and the part that follows is the part that should actually stay with you. The core idea behind the bat bomb, that Japan's densely built, wood and paper cities were catastrophically vulnerable to widespread, simultaneous fire was correct. That idea did not die with Project X-ray. It simply found a different delivery system. Louis Feazer's napalm, the same gelled incendiary compound he had shrunk down to strap onto individual bats, went on to become the primary weapon of the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan during the final months of the war. Beginning in March 1945, under the command of General Curtis LeMay, American B-29 bombers abandoned high-altitude precision bombing in favor of low-altitude nighttime raids, dropping massive quantities of napalm-based incendiaries directly onto Japanese cities. The first of these raids, against Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, ignited a firestorm that killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night and left much of the city reduced to ash. Similar raids followed against dozens of other Japanese cities over the following months. City after city built from the same wood and paper that had first caught Lytle Adams's attention as a vulnerability worth exploiting. In other words, the exact outcome Adams imagined while watching bats stream out of Carlsbad caverns arrived anyway, delivered not by 1,000 bats with tiny bombs clipped to their bodies, but by fleets of bombers carrying the very chemical compound that had been invented for the bat program in the first place. The bat bomb failed to ever fly. The fire it was built to start did not. Then, months later, an even more decisive weapon arrived. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within days the war in the Pacific was over. The Manhattan Project, the program that had outcompeted the bat bomb for resources and institutional priority back in 1944, had delivered a weapon capable of ending a war in a single afternoon, rather than one strategist had once hoped to end gradually, city by burning city. It is tempting, looking back now, to treat the bat bomb purely as a curiosity, a strange, almost comic detour in the history of American weapons research. But sitting underneath the strangeness is something worth taking seriously. In the early 1940s, some of the most capable scientific minds in the country, working with the direct approval of the President of the United States, spent 2 years and real money trying to weaponize an animal's most basic survival instinct, its need to find a dark, safe crevice to hide in, and turn that instinct into a mechanism for mass urban destruction. They very nearly succeeded. What stopped them was not a moral objection raised somewhere in the chain of command. It was a scheduling problem, a straightforward calculation that a different weapon would be ready sooner and would end the war more decisively. That is the part of this story that reaches forward into the world you live in now. Military planners today are still running that same basic calculation, just with different technology sitting on the table in front of them. Instead of bats, laboratories now experiment with swarms of small drones, hundreds or thousands of them, cheap, expendable, and coordinated to disperse and strike targets in a pattern no single defense system can track or intercept in time. It is the exact same logic that drove Project X-ray 80 years earlier. Overwhelm a target not with one large weapon, but with an uncountable number of small ones, each individually insignificant, collectively unstoppable. The bat bomb arrived decades before the engineering existed to make it reliable. Its underlying idea did not disappear when the program was canceled. It simply waited for the technology to catch up. Somewhere in the New Mexico desert, on ground not far from what used to be Carlsbad Army Airfield, the bats are still there, still pouring out of the caverns every summer evening at dusk in that same dark, spiraling column that caught the attention of a traveling dentist back in December 1941. Tourists still gather at the cave mouth to watch them rise. Almost none of them know that this exact sight, this natural, ancient behavior of an animal finding shelter as night falls, once convinced the government of the most powerful nation on earth that it had found a weapon capable of burning an entire country to the ground. A weapon so close to working that it took a competing, far more terrible program to make the case for shelving it. The bats never knew what they had inspired. They just kept doing what bats have always done. And for one strange chapter in history, that was almost enough to change the outcome of a war, and the only reason it never got the chance was that something even more devastating arrived first. Consider how differently this story might be remembered had the timeline shifted by even a single year, had the Manhattan Project stumbled or the BAT program moved faster. A version of history in which the weapon that reshaped the end of the Second World War was not a single blinding flash over a city, but a slow, scattered scourge of 1,000 small fires breaking out across rooftops in the dark, started by an animal doing nothing more than what it had always done at dusk.